My name's Jane Hilderman. I'm the Executive Director of the Samara Center for Democracy, one of the co-presenters of the DemocracyXChange, and really excited, that we're all here together. I said this on Twitter, but it feels a little bit like a homecoming, in that there's like this warmth in the room around all these people who really care about democracy. And that is a wonderful thing to be holding in common today. So it's a great tribe, and thank you for making time and voting with your bodies and time to come out this morning. So as you know from the introduction this morning, the conference is dedicated to urgent questions about our democracy and democracies elsewhere too. But this panel is certainly focused, I think, on Canada. And one thing, when we were putting together the panel at Samara, we didn't want to forget a conversation about some of our more formal architecture of politics, especially political parties. I just wanted to do a quick audience poll. How many of you have been a member of a political party at some point in your lifetime? Okay, I'd say that's well over the sort of normal range of, 3 to 8%. I almost think climbing up to 40%. And how many of you have been engaged in a civil society sort of organization, whether that be, a club, a neighborhood collective, an advocacy organization, or like a religious group or something that's involved in the community? So even lots of hands there too. This is a very engaged group. We wanted to, talk a bit about, where should our energies be directed in democracy as we're trying to strengthen it. Samara Canada is obviously one of those civil society organizations that has a mission that is trying to strengthen democracy. But I think our political parties too have a really important role to strengthen democracy. But I want to put them in conversation with each other to talk about some of the strengths and weaknesses of both approaches, and have framed it as a bit of a face-off. And we have, I think, a really great panel here with different perspectives that I've encouraged to hold contrarian views and civilly disagree with one another to model that. So joining us this morning, I'll start at the far left. We have Sevaun Palvetzian, who is the CEO of Civic Action. Civic Action works to build a very deep culture of civic engagement in the GTHA, mobilizing citizens to actively shape their communities and invest in a new generation of leadership. Karim Bardeesy, as you heard this morning, is co-founder of the Ryerson Leadership Lab and a distinguished visiting prof here at the University of Ryerson University. And so, well, very much now a part of the civil society space. Karim previously worked in politics as Deputy Principal Secretary to the Premier of Ontario, Kathleen Wynne. So he's seen inside politics too. We're really pleased this morning to be joined by Minister Karina Gould, who was elected in 2015 to represent Burlington. She's the Minister of the Government of Canada in charge of our democratic institutions, a pretty exciting portfolio in 2019. And she'll be giving a keynote actually after this panel back in the auditorium. And finally, Michael Chong, who is also an MP across the aisle in the House of Commons, representing, and a neighbor. Wonderful. Representing Wellington Halton Hills. You were elected in 2004, right? Yeah. And so has spent a lot of time in politics. And during your time in office, you've led the charge on the Reform Act, which was sort of an effort to rebalance some of the power between party leaders and the rest of the party. So I think you'll have some great insights for us this morning. So I've challenged each of our panelists to sort of open up with a 3-minute thesis about where they think parties and civil society are going, good or bad. And so to kick us off, I hope Michael can get us started.
Well, thank you, Jane. Thank you all for coming out here today. It's wonderful to see such a big, engaged crowd to talk about democratic reform. The point I'm going to make with you today is that we need major reform of political parties in Canada. And the argument I will make and try to convince you about is that political parties are too much like civil society groups. Civil society groups, or the third sector as people often refer to it in Canada, are largely made up of private not-for-profit groups or private not-for-profit foundations and charities. And while they do great work in Canada, they are privately run and privately controlled by their membership and by their boards of directors and their leadership. And the problem, I think, in Canada is that political parties operate as private clubs, as private organizations, and they need to be brought into the public realm and made wholly public institutions. And here's why. In practical terms in Canada, the only way to become a member of parliament is first to become a party candidate. In practical terms, the only way to become a premier of a province or a prime minister of this country or leader of the opposition in this country is first to become party leader. And if the way in which we elect party candidates and party leaders has been privatized through a private, closed club party system, then we've in essence privatized a good portion of our democracy and our public institutions. And so that is the case I will be making with you today, is that like the United States did about a century ago, we need to embark on major reform of political parties to bring party nominations and party leadership contests out of the private realm of political parties and into the public regulation of Elections Canada and Elections Ontario, and take away the kind of inside jobs that often take place during these party nominations and party leadership contests. And that is the main point I hope I will be able to convince you about today.
Thank you. And sticking to the 3-minute max. Thank you. I'm going to jump to Karim Bardeesy just to hear from civil society. We're going to go back and forth. Is that okay? Unless you're really ready to jump in. Karim, what's been your experience?
My experience is as someone who has worn coats of 3 different colors in partisan terms, who became a journalist and then was inspired to get involved, and then discovered that not only was partisanship a necessary part of our system, but that I actually liked it, and maybe my knuckles dragged a bit closer to the ground as a result of that, but that partisanship is a necessary part of our system. I agree with Michael on some of his diagnoses. I'll engage maybe on the specific policy solution a bit later. One thing for, I think, folks here to understand is political parties are very peculiar organizations. If you took a design-driven approach to the activity of joining a political party, it might be very alienating. You go to a nomination meeting or you go to a riding association meeting if you find out about it, and there are these arcane traditions and rules. There's a lot of procedural things being discussed. People are generally there for the people, sometimes for the ideology, but it's often very different at the riding association level than what you imagine politics to actually be like. And that can be alienating for a lot of folks. The kinds of things that are often required internal to parties to do the kind of thing to bring accountability internal to organizations are often seen as the activities of cranks and malcontents. So people who try to do reform internal to parties are often seen as kind of alien to the party. And the people who tend to be most successful within parties, again, I'm sort of speaking anecdotally to this, are the people who are able to operate in those shadowy ways and are able to achieve ends that get the support of enough people in the party. There are some tendencies towards that. And you have within parties, and I think this is true of all political parties, you have this back and forth between the people who are devoted to the rules of the party and the people who are trying to make the party electable, trying to broaden the base, trying to make it achieve its ends. So we have this kind of this tension there. My approach would be twofold. One, to create a narrative where partisanship and the possibilities through partisanship, because as both Michael and Jane mentioned, partisanship is a necessary part of our system, and unless we have wholesale change, that will not change, especially in our Westminster tradition. We need a better invitation into political parties. That can be done through both partisans and non-partisans. One thing I would like to see more of is a more positive view of the potential of political parties and partisanship in civil society organizations. There are a lot of organizations that work in a cross-partisan way, and that's very important, and there are a lot that work in a non-partisan way, and that's very important. We need to celebrate the political activity through partisanship a little bit more, and that I see something, especially election time, you'll see a lot of what I call, actually this is a term that James Gennaro, former policy advisor to Premier Wynne, coined, hipster non-partisanship. People say, oh yeah, no, I love your ideas. Oh yeah, no, like you guys are on board, like, you know, your agenda, whatever the party agenda is. Oh, but I wouldn't want to get involved. And I'll start these 3 social enterprises instead. Those social enterprises can be very important, but there's a coreness to our institutions that needs to have some regard. So that would be one point that I would urge us all to consider. There's a policy tool that I just want to put on the table, maybe reacting a bit to Michael. The most potent charitable dollar that is available to be spent by you is for a political party. You get more bang for your buck by giving to a political party than you give to any other charitable organization. So Michael's view is to bring this into regulation. I would like to bring this into the world of competition and allow more organizations, maybe with local chapters that are pure pro-democracy organizations, have the ability to provide that kind of level of tax credit with a certain level of accreditation. So you could have a well-funded, non-partisan or multi-partisan infrastructure that was supported by citizens that could be a bulwark against some of the political parties.
Okay, thanks, Karim. We've got thesis and policy solution there. Minister Gould, I want to hear, especially, you've been wearing the mantle of having to shape the agenda around how we regulate democracy. So where are parties fitting in for you, and the role that civil society might uniquely play?
Absolutely. So first of all, I'm also delighted to be here and happy to be on this great panel with, as Jane will see, very different views, which is good. And that's a strength and a bulwark of our democracy. I guess I'm going to speak on behalf of parties here, because I don't actually think that there's, you know, that we can always get better, but there's something to say for our political parties and our political system here in Canada. And the thing that I would caution is not painting all parties with the same brush. They are very different organizations. They have the same objective, which is to get elected and to form government, but they're not organized in the same way. And I think that one of the things that, you know, my political party did when the Prime Minister became the leader is he opened up membership. And so he got rid of a fee for paying membership. And we saw an exponential increase in the people who joined the party. And part of it is because political parties represent organizations and organizing entities for people who share ideas and ideals and values. And that's not a bad thing. And even if we were to change our electoral system to proportional representation or something else, parties are still going to play a very important role in that. In fact, if you change our system, arguably parties would have an even stronger role to play, because they would be more of the gatekeepers in terms of who is elected and who forms government. But all that being said, when it comes to our regulations, I mean, nomination contests and leadership spending is under the Elections Act and is regulated. I don't disagree with Michael, and I think this is something that we should be looking at more, because the moment of democracy in Canada, I always believe, is the nomination level. That's when people get to choose who is going to represent them in their political party. And that is a really, really important moment, because a lot of people don't think about how I became the Liberal candidate or how Michael became the Conservative candidate. But that's when you have groups of people locally organizing to say, this is the person that I want to run representing me under this party banner. And then the people in the riding decide which person they want to be their member of parliament ultimately. But I think that's a really important moment that we should be looking at more closely. But I do want to give a shout out to political parties, because it's for many people, it's a signpost, it's a marker, It's a way to say, hey, here are the 10 things or the 5 things I care about. Is that reflected in this political party? If I elect candidate X from party Y, I'm going to have a good sense of where they're going to stand. Maybe not on all of the issues, but on the issues that I care about. And that makes it easier for me as a citizen to make my choice about who I want to be represented. I also think that sometimes we tend to think of parties as these like nefarious organizations. And when you join a political party, you often realize they're just made up of people, right? They're just made up of citizens who are passionate about politics and passionate about their country and want to achieve certain objectives. And Jane mentioned a statistic of 3 to 8%. I think it's actually 2% of Canadians are members of political parties. And often what I tell people is if you want to impact policy and you want to impact the future, join a political party. Because all of a sudden you're going to be part of that policy process. I can't speak for the other political parties because I'm not a member of theirs, so I don't know exactly how they work internally. But I can say that the legalization of cannabis, for example, was a policy item that was put forward by the Young Liberals, right? And it made its way through the process into our platform, and then as we become government, into actual legislation and public policy. And so I think that the political parties can be a really useful vehicle. Of course, we should make them more accountable. Of course, they should be more transparent. But I do think that they're important organizing entities for Canadians to be able to make decisions about who they want to be governed by and how they want to be governed. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And you can see we've got some different points of view on the floor. Bringing us home, Sev, can you speak a little bit perhaps about your perspective having led an organization that, as I said, recruiting amazing people, supporting their leadership development in the city. Where do parties figure, or are people really keen to work outside sort of these traditional structures and why?
Thank you, Jane. It is such a treat to be here this morning, and I am very thankful to be invited to share some thoughts. So here's where my context is going to come from. I'm a proud Canadian, studied American history and political science here in Canada, and then moved to Washington, D.C., where I worked for a few years, close to politics, right up to the line. Then I came back to Canada, and I served as a civil servant in the Ontario government, close to politics, right up to the line. And now I am the CEO of Civic Action, a nonpartisan organization that focuses on those big urban issues that need an all-hands-on-deck approach to address, and works very closely with elected officials and right up to the line. But at no point in my career have I stepped over the line to become a partisan player. I am not one of the 2% that is a political party member. And that's been rather intentional in my experience. I share that so that as I share with you 3 observations I've had through the culmination of those experiences, I want to give you a bit of a vantage point from where I sit. One is the challenge of the echo chamber that is increasingly getting louder and borderline inbred. Let me give you an example. Through recent changes here in the City of Toronto, the Premier cut our council down to 25 members. 1/4 of all those city council members who remain are either the brother, the son, the father, or the sister of other politicians. Politics is increasingly becoming a family business. Not in every case. But when you look at it as an assembly, there's a discernible trend. The club. And a lot of folks don't see themselves reflected in the club. And a lot of folks, it takes more than just a party membership to join association with the Big C Club. The second thing, the observation that I've had, is around the culture of what we put these people through. The terranium of public life is brutal. We throw rocks at you, inside and outside. As a woman, what you deal with is 3 times worse on social media. Twitter has become the Roman Colosseum of our era. Why people would want to put themselves through that is staggering to me because it's no longer about facts and arguments. You need an enemy, and you need the artillery, and you need the cavalry to beat them in many cases, not all, in many cases. So the culture is hurting, the environment is vitriolic, and here's the good news that I'll end on in my last observation. While government has continued to work hard, and there are many brilliant leaders who have served, some of them in this room, from previous governments as well, the rest of society has been busy working too. Did you know that Canada has the second largest NGO sector in the world? And most of it's here? We are outperforming the world in civil society bench strength. I see it every day of my life. The Me Too movement is a great example. For hundreds of years, the advancement of women and girls has been moving at a glacial pace. It's going to take another 217 more years for that to hit parity. So here's what happened. Through Twitter, and this is now in 81 countries, the Me Too movement, we have revolutionized in 24 months what it took 60 years to see through. Did you know that the business community is driving the next generation of gender equality? I've sat in my office in the last 2 weeks with 2 in-house legal counsel for big Canadian companies. They're women. They were working in big firms where they were tired of the glass ceiling and tired of what it took to be successful there. So they went into the client side. And guess what they do from the client side? They say, the firm that they are retained to work with, I want to see diversity on the team that's attached to me. They're driving change because they're powerful clients. That's awesome. In California, the pension boards, biggest one's run by a woman. And in California, you can no longer have a gag rule which protects sexual harassment or claims. In other words, if you have a Me Too in your ranks, you can't pay them off and clamp it down and have that not be a news story anymore. And so pension boards are now saying, I want to see your reports on all those claims. Because before I choose to invest in you, character and the audit thereof is going to be part of what I look like. I give that as an example of just one of many aspects of change that has continuously been driven by government, but is not being driven as aggressively as it sometimes can be from the outside. Thank you.
Okay, great. Yes. So I'm going to try to moderate a conversation with 4 very different perspectives. Wish me luck. Let's come back to, I think, so there's a point of view, sort of a defense of parties from the minister, and a position from at least 2 folks that I think, well, and sympathy to change parties, I think held by a few, and then a strong voice around, that a really important change can happen outside of parties, and we can't forget about that. I do want to come back to parties because I think there is something compelling about the reality of, if you want to hold power in Canada, in our Westminster system, as said, parties are something you can't entirely ignore. So Michael and Karim, you both talked a bit about the need for some change to happen to be more open. Can that happen? Is there appetite within the parties, or does that have to come from without? And I'd be curious, especially about your experience with the Reform Act, Michael.
I think there's appetite within parties for reform, but I also think there has to be pressure from without. A lot of the ideas that I have about political reform of political parties actually comes out of my own party. I remember in 2004 when Ken Bosenkool helped shape the platform. One of the things we ran on was for for Elections Canada to hold party memberships, to get away from this clandestine business of paying a $10 fee and then, not to have the right to join a political party. Like in Canada today, it's not your right to join a political party. Political parties can deny you membership, they can kick you out, and you have to pay a $10 fee, and you have to renew that fee each and every year. And if you don't do that, you can't. In some parties. Well, no, that's not true. In the Liberal Party, you still have to pay a fee if you want to be a voting member and go to a national convention. And so my view is that we need to go down the path of what we proposed in 2004, which is to have party membership registered with Elections Canada, who keeps a permanent roll of party membership that you do not have to renew every year. That's the list that we can rely on for party nomination and party leadership contests. It's what they do in the United States. In the United States, after the Tammany Hall reforms, they decided to get away from this private club way of operating political parties. And they decided that when you register to vote in the United States once in your life, you then also at the same time register your membership in a political party. You can register as a Democrat, as a Republican, as an independent, as a member of the Green Party, and a plethora of other parties in the United States. But once you're registered, you never have to register again. And whenever there is a party nomination contest, like there was in New York City, where Alexandria Cortez took out a long-standing incumbent, that party membership role is the one relied upon to get people out to vote. And an election, a party nomination contest that's publicly regulated by local election authorities. That revolution down there, where she took out a long-standing member of the US House of Representatives, would never be allowed to happen in Canada because party leaders would kibosh it and kill it before it ever got out the gate.
I see a hot pursuit from Minister Gould.
Well, I mean, I appreciate that, and I think there's some merit there, but what I would counter is that doesn't allow for change in parties either, right? So, I mean, what we see in the US, and I'm just going on your example here, is two-party system. Very, very entrenched. It's really hard for new actors to break into that and to break out. And I think the other part is that, Canadians change their minds a lot. Right? This notion of being a partisan. I mean, Karim talked about that he's been part of 3 different parties. Cool, right? And this idea that I'm a liberal and I've been a liberal for a long time, but it could one day wake up and say, actually, I have changed my mind, or I think this, or the party's changed. And I think that there's an important agency that citizens need to be able to say, this is what I support right now, or I'm changing my mind. And a system that's more entrenched makes that more difficult. I just want to turn to some examples around the country because I think it's really interesting. Obviously, the Liberals, the Conservatives, the NDP have kind of been the 3 traditional parties in Canada. But look at the Quebec election. Right? They had a whole new party landscape. They still had political parties that helped organize and inform voters of the different values and ideas and ideals that they had, but new players were able to come in there. Look at New Brunswick, the Greens, the other, I can't remember, I'm forgetting the name of the other party that just came up, the People's kind of party? People's Alliance, thanks. The People's Alliance came up there. The Greens are making headway in PEI. We have the People's Party with Maxime Bernier here. We have a really dynamic landscape, actually. And so even though we kind of have these 2 more traditional parties, we have a lot of dynamism. And I think that actually enabling them to morph and change over time as Canadians morph and change over time is really important. And I think that that's actually something that is something that we should be taking into consideration as we think about political parties and how Canadians engage with them.
Great. And I'm going to hold your thought, Michael. Karim, adding to that point around, especially Michael's idea, if you register, does that take away that hipster nonpartisan cool factor if everyone's just a partisan?
Well, we definitely need to expand that 2%. And that, I think, is a key role where civil society and political parties can do things together. Political parties need to work to change their culture to make joining a political party more acceptable. And that involves outreach and also a greater appetite from civil society players, in my opinion. The party I'm affiliated with, the Ontario Liberal Party, has gone through some hard times of late. We will need to go to places where people are congregating, where we have not been, or to those places where we've been speaking to people rather than listening. If we do that, if we start to go where people are already gathering in a nonpartisan way, in a cross-partisan way, in a hipster way, and say, actually, there's this political party that we are in that we think espouses your values. Come join us and shape that party. That in concert with, frankly, political circumstances, that in concert with the explicit statement that we want to gain power to do these things is what can grow the audience of a political party. You mentioned New Brunswick. I'm from New Brunswick, and they used to have lifetime memberships. The New Brunswick Liberal Association used to have a lifetime membership. And at the end of the Richard Hatfield era, because there was such an appetite from a lot of places to have a change, 1 in 7 New Brunswickers was a member of the New Brunswick Liberal Association. So circumstances and a political party that is making outreach attempts can really, I think, drive the civil society engagement. My policy solution around other players that could be well-funded, and Samara and Civic Action would be examples of organizations that, if they got a super tax credit, could then really drive political engagement in a nonpartisan, cross-partisan way, I think would help create a culture that made the political party outreaches more acceptable.
Thank you. Michael, do you need a quick in? And then I want to give Sev back the floor to talk a little bit about nonpartisanship versus partisanship. But
sure, I think the reason why we have so many political parties popping up in Canada compared to the United States is quite simple. People cannot find their voice in the old mainline parties. And so that what they end up doing is they end up starting a new party. And that's why we have all these new parties starting up, because the top-down structure of the old mainline parties in Canada prevents grassroots people from having their voice heard. Whereas in the United States, there is no top-down control. It's all bottom-up. And as a result, most Americans can find their voice in the Democratic or Republican parties. They can shape those parties, and there's not a need to start a third party. Sometimes it happens with Ross Perot, for example, but more often than not, people can make change happen within parties, the brokerage, large brokerage mainstream parties themselves. That can't happen in Canada. And I go back to the example of Ms. Cortez. She took out a long-standing member of the US House of Representatives in a shocking party nomination contest. Never, ever happen in Canada. Why? Because parties make it difficult to join. Parties keep the rules about nomination contests secretive. Parties can deny you even from running for a party nomination. They can change the dates of nomination. They regulate the nomination contest and a whole bunch of stuff. And here's the proof in the pudding. And I'm being nonpartisan about this. In Ontario, we had a criminal investigation by the OPP of a nomination contest in Northern Ontario of one party, and another criminal investigation going on by another police force of a nomination contest in Hamilton. This happens all the time because these contests are privately regulated by private parties. They need to be brought into the open and publicly regulated. It's high time we take parties out of the 19th century as private clubs with clandestine rules and secretive ways of working, bring them into the public regulation of Elections Ontario and Elections Canada. And we can do that in 12 months. I remember in the 2004 platform, we promised that at T1 tax time, when you file your T1 general income tax and benefit return, we would just enlarge the box on page 1. Right now it says, do you want to register your address and your name with Elections Canada to be on the voters list? Well, we'll just add a bit more to that box and say, do you want to register as a member of one of the following federal political parties? Check off a box, you're a member. Next time there's a party nomination or party leadership contest, Elections Canada will notify you about the date and time of it, and you get to vote in it. That's public participation. We take party membership from 2% to 20% overnight.
A strong idea there. Hang on. I want to give Sev a chance to come back in, especially as someone who, as you said, has gone up to the line and not crossed the line. Do you find in Canada that there's enough is the gap now too big between nonpartisan and partisan, or can we work closer together, sort of Karim suggested, to try to have a sort of that greater participatory ethic between both civil society and parties?
My first job, Jane, was at a video store. It was awesome. And you came in with your card, and you went to the shelves, and you picked the movie you wanted. It was empty. You'd bring it to us at the front. We'd fill it with the movie we stored behind us in the cassette, right? The VHS sort of Please Be Kind rewind. I'd scan your card. I'd scan the movie. I'd remind you about the rewind fee. And then you'd leave the store and go home and watch your movie. You needed a membership to have an experience. You do not need a membership to have a civic experience. the opportunities to get stuff done outside of a party, I believe, are bigger than being inside. You don't need to drink any Kool-Aid if you don't join. And there are varying degrees of Kool-Aid intensity, flavor, and expectation in many of our parties, yeah? But it's a party for a reason. There is a cohesive expectation for a reason. It doesn't work if y'all don't get in line at some point. And I believe most of us prize autonomy of independent views on a range of topics and an autonomy of how we double-click certain issues for certain degrees of focus. I think most people are more comfortable not having that membership and still finding ways to get stuff done than getting the video card to have the movie experience.
Yep. Well, strong points. Well articulated there. Minister, did you want to add?
Well, I just wanted to say that I think this is all right? Like, I think that a healthy democracy has a robust and diverse ecosystem. Part of that will be within the party. A lot of that is without the party. There needs to be flexibility to move in and out, to make decisions. I have an issue with checking it off on your taxes because not everyone wants wants the government or other people to know that they're a member of that party as well. I mean, I obviously am a partisan, and I don't think there's anything wrong with partisanship, but, I understand that there are some people who say, I want to make a small donation to this party because I support that idea, but I don't necessarily want my neighbor to know that, right? Because of whatever reason. And I think that's okay. And that's actually part of your democratic right to be able to participate and to share without having the entire world know it. I mean, one of the challenges in the United States, which I don't always take as the example of the best democracy experience out there, but is that, once you're registered, everybody knows. And that can be a real limiting factor for some people, or it can have a different experience than what we have here in Canada. I'm a very proud Canadian, and I'm really proud of what we have here. There's a reason why we're a really good country. Of course, we always need to be striving to be improving and being better, but I don't think we should just throw the bathwater out just because, right? Like, there's actually a lot of really good stuff going on here. But one of the things that I think is important that Karim kind of touched on is that we are not singular people, right? I am not just a partisan, right? I am also, I was before, but, members of other things. Now I can't because I'm a minister. But, I used to be a member of the Bruce Trail Club, right? I used to sit on the board of, some community organization. I am a multifaceted person that tends to align with the Liberal Party because of the causes I support and the things that they support as well. And I think, as Sev mentioned, that there has to be some cohesion in political parties, because otherwise it doesn't serve that goalpost marker for people as they're making decisions when they're voting of what kind of country they want and what they expect the party that's seeking to govern them will do once they're in government. And I think that's really important. But the point is that there has to be dialogue and there has to be communication. And of course, there's going to be engagement with different parts of civil society. And I think that's the important part, that we want to make sure that those conversations happen and that engagement happens. But we don't view, because it's not true, that political parties are siloed from civil society. In fact, they're very dynamic and engaged. And I would agree with Karim that I think organizations like Civic Action and Samara should be supported and should be encouraged to do what they're doing, because they're encouraging people to participate and to be engaged and to look at politics in a different way that speaks to themselves as citizens and their contribution to the community. And so I don't want to sound naive, but I'm really positive and optimistic. And I think that we need to also remember the good that we have and work to improve what we already have here.
Follow-up from me. How do you think parties could best attract more participation. Like you mentioned, the Liberal Party's decision to get rid of sort of formal membership to participate in the leadership race is lowering one barrier. But are there others that you see that maybe this isn't a question then of government regulation, but within parties that you would like to have a more imaginative structure, a newer structure?
I mean, I think one thing that Sev mentioned that I think is really important is that there's an engagement, right? And that it's, it's not just seen as, so yes, everyone has to stay in line at some point because you want to know that your party stands for something, right? That if you have an issue, that, people who are part of this party are going to stand for it generally, right? Not everyone's going to agree on every issue. That's impossible. We're never going to get there. But to make sure that there is room for engagement and room to be part of the process, I found that, in my own experience as a politician, as a member of parliament, and previously as a candidate, I would often go to the door and ask people what the issue they cared about was. And they'd say, well, I don't know, right? I'm like, well, do you have kids? Yeah, I've got kids. Okay, so is childcare important, or maybe playing hockey, or I don't know, or the environment maybe? And really making it tangible for people, right? Like these issues are issues that we care about as well, and that we're trying to work to make better. And actually, your voice and your support and your ideas can be part of our policy development and what we eventually put into the pipeline, into government. And one of the things that I think, and I know I'm monopolizing the time a little bit right now, but I got lots to say, is that
and you have a keynote later.
And I have a keynote later, but I'm going to talk about something different. So, but is that, we live in a world where we're used to getting things really quickly, right? Like you can order food, you can order your dry cleaning, you can get everything done with the click of a button. And politics doesn't work that way. Politics takes time, and democracy takes time, because it's about us engaging and debating and discussing, and me trying to encourage you to say that we shouldn't put our partisan label on our tax returns, and Michael saying we should, and having this conversation, and then you making up your mind in terms of what we should be doing. And that's part of the process. And I think sometimes, especially today, we want quick returns. And actually, democracy is a process, and it's my job and Michael's job and Karim's job and Sev's job to try and convince you that we're right and you should follow what we're suggesting. But that takes time, and that's okay. But that's the brilliance of democracy, because otherwise it would be a dictatorship, right?
Right. And I suppose that's why we don't have jobs like video store clerks anymore either. Karim.
So I think this might be a research agenda item for Samara and Civic Action and others. So I'm going to put an intuition on the table and check it with the others. My intuition is actually that political parties are more representative than many civil society organizations. So what do I mean by that? Who here is a part of in a religious community? And how did you come to that community? Generally through family. So who here is part of a professional association? How did you come to that? Through the organization of the professional association. So those are potent civil society organizations. How do people come to political parties? Generally by being asked, or generally by being motivated around an issue. You take the aggregation of people who are involved in political parties, and you actually have a fairly representative group. The problem is we don't have enough participation in those parties. So we don't actually have a representation challenge as much as we have an inclusion challenge, is my impression. And the inclusion challenge, I think, is caused by many of the points that are being put on the table here.
And on that note, speaking about inclusion, I want to have some questions from the audience. So I'll give you a quick warning. And we have a mic roving. I see someone coming up at the back, again, in the corner.
And can I say on the representation, on the inclusion challenge, I think that Indigenous Canadians still are greatly underrepresented in political parties. So that might be one of the inclusion differences. But generally I see fairly representative representation of populations in political.
And maybe just as a researcher hat note, of what we do know about surveys of members is that they're not that representative of Canadians. They tend to be older, more male, more white. But that always needs to be updated. So I'll take that challenge. Question.
Hi there. Two of the more local dimensions that were mentioned were the reduction in the size of city council. And I wanted to ask what kind of, have we had robust enough civil society responses to something that is fundamentally enacted by people who have video, rental memberships and are not just not rewinding, but recording over what they took out.
I think that's a question for Sev. So if you could borrow
Hey,
my...
Vass. How you doing? Is your question, great analogy, is your question, what's the role of civil society in that example where the council cuts were made?
What is the role, and have we seen a sufficient enough response that's motivating and engaging for people? Because I think it can be, in a majority context, it can also be isolating. People can feel powerless as well, right?
Right.
Which can also turn you off the
Right.
political aspects because you don't see a role for yourself necessarily.
So this is a great example where the province, for those who, I'm sure everyone in this room has everyone followed this file? This is a very well-informed group. So this was a decision made by the government with essentially no consultation that city council would go in the middle of a race from 47 down to 25 overnight. No consultation. It was not in the mandate as something that this party was going to do. So everyone was caught off guard. And there were many groups saying and individuals saying, what? Like, you can't just do this. Ultimately, the province was playing musical chairs and appointed itself DJ. What's going on? No, keep going. Oh, okay, all these hands. Got it. So Vass's question, I think, is a great one. Was there a loud enough response? Was there enough civic activism? And I think this hits an interesting rub because there was a very vocal minority of people that had great offense to this and took to different channels to voice that. Shockingly, or maybe not to groups like this, the vast majority didn't care one bit. Not even 1% of one bit. So this is concerning for a bunch of reasons, not because if you have a view one way or another. And from my position, certainly, what was the intended outcome? Is it efficiencies? Is it cost? Like, what are we doing that for? And then what's the fair process to land at that outcome? None of that was done. So process, fail. Okay? Process, fail. But the fact that there was this giant schism between a progressive group who was very upset and then the vast majority of 3 million Ontarians that didn't seem to care at all, that's interesting. And back to this point on democracy being representative, if the systems and the voices are only aware by by the bedrock folks that study it, that understand the nuance of changing the rules midway through, that understand you've already got your signs posted and whatnot, the topsoil people don't care. They are no less citizens, by the way, than anyone else. And sometimes I worry that we have views that diminish the validity of people that don't share the same passion over the same issues. They aren't ignorant. They aren't malinformed. These are mums and dads and aunts and uncles and grandmas and grandpas that have very strong opinions on many topics. But the lane into the conversation is sometimes very elitist. Yeah. And don't assume that people aren't in that lane because they haven't heard you talk yet.
A good reminder for a choir audience. So I really want to get at least 2 more questions on the floor before we wrap. So let's go here, and I know there's a gentleman over here that will take third. I know, this is the problem. Go ahead.
Hi. So I used to be a former political staffer, and one of the major issues that I found while I was working on Parliament Hill is the echo chambers within each party. I find that, each party has obviously variance, diversity of perspectives, but when you have things like whipped votes and everyone, is supposed to just align to one specific ideology, even though there is variance within the group on that issue, How do you ensure that you are encouraging diversity of perspectives within the group and not shunning people within each party to voice their opinions that are different from the masses within the party?
everyone wants in, but I'm going to turn to. Oh yeah, let's get 2 questions on the floor so that we can divide and conquer among the panel.
Thank you. And along the same line, actually, what can we do about having empowered party members, as Michael mentioned, because you become a party member and you can't do much except just go around, knock on the doors during the election times. The empowered party members who can really run the agenda. The example that Minister mentioned about the policy proposal for cannabis, yes, it was accepted by the party at the time because you had a leader who was young and that policy resonated with that leader. Otherwise, it would have been very difficult. In fact, it is extremely difficult across all political parties for party members to have their voice heard. And that hierarchy actually replicates within the Parliament Hill with the backbenchers. They have much less power than the others. They cannot be really the voice of their constituency.
Okay, great. Thank you. Great question. Which one do you want to tackle, Michael?
Well, I can answer both in one answer.
Oh, okay, really fast.
I think the heart of the challenge that you're identifying here, both questioners, is that party leaders in Canada, particularly the Prime Minister, have too much power. They can not only control their elected members of Parliament, they control the party. Riding associations don't exist without the party leader's signature. In fact, just before the last general election, Mr. Trudeau, when he was leader of the third party in the House of Commons, deregistered and re-registered some 150 Liberal riding associations overnight with one signature on each of those documents. Riding associations exist at the pleasure of the leader. They can take them out overnight ad infinitum. Let me say this. Let me shock you into this reality. What if I were to say to you, this coming October, you could only vote in the next general election if you paid a $10 membership fee to a political party, if you had made sure that that membership was taken out within the last 12 months and that party had the right to reject your membership and deny you the vote. Well, that's what we do in Canada. Political parties in Canada are far more important than in the United States. And let me give you a tangible example of that. In Canada, because we have the Westminster parliamentary system, political parties, in effect, can directly elect prime ministers and premiers without going to the people. And the most recent example of that was my late colleague, the Honourable Jim Prentice, who was Premier of the province of Alberta. He did not become Premier of the province of Alberta through an election. He was elected through the private process of the Alberta PC party. When that party decided that he would become party leader, even though he didn't have a seat in the Alberta legislature, the Lieutenant Governor of the province appointed him as full Premier, full head of government of the province of Alberta with all the attendant powers that entails. And the same thing can happen federally. So the point I'm making is that political parties have to be brought out of the shadows of 19th century private clubs where you don't have a right to join into the public realm of this century where your membership is a right, your membership is free, and where it's easy for you to join and participate in these party leadership and party nomination contests because they are the gatekeepers of our democracy, these parties.
So that's one response to changing the culture inside parties. Karim and the Minister, be as succinct as possible, please.
I just need to say a couple of things because first of all, when I was knocking on doors, I'd often get people say to me, you know what, I'd love to vote for you, but I can't vote for Justin. And I'd say, don't worry, you're only voting for me. Why? Because in no parliament or legislator across Canada do we directly elect the leader. We always elect members of parliament, and our tradition has always been that the party that forms the majority forms the government and their leader becomes prime minister. Michael right now is advocating for a switch to a US presidential system, which is different than what we have here. However, what is also important to note is the fact that he was talking about the plus 100 riding associations. That's because we changed the riding boundaries, right? And so you had to do that. So I think it's really important to make sure that we have the facts on the table here. But one of the other things that I wanted to mention in response to the first question is that's kind of an us problem, not a them problem. And what I mean by that is it's an us problem as policy leaders, as people who care about these issues, that we need to do a better job making these issues important and relevant to day-to-day Canadians. And I think part of that gets to civic education. education, and it's the role that Samara and Civic Action can play in helping Canadians really think about what their citizenship means in its fullness. And I think that we as governments, both at the federal, provincial, and municipal level, have a role to play in that. The other thing that I would say is that I think it's also important that, and I feel like I'm beating the same drum here, but government is relevant for people. Government makes decisions in their day-to-day lives that has impacts on how they live their lives. And we need to make sure that people understand that and recognize that, because sometimes it seems too far away. Okay. And that's not an easy thing to do, but it's incumbent upon us as leaders in this room, because we care about these issues, to try and make that relevant.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I'm trying to squeeze in Karim's answer, because I still don't think we've talked about how do you protect that diversity within parties for an exchange of views rather than sort of the shutting down and the discipline.
Yeah, so this is about informed dissent, these questions in part. And I used to write talking points, the gospel of what the party was going to say on one thing or another, and we often didn't even put the facts in the talking points. We just this is the official view. And one day, shouldn't we actually put what the facts are and then say what we say about the facts in these talking points? So there's a bit of a problem there, and I would say that there's something that parties need to do is build a culture of informed dissent, which starts with a culture of learning within political parties. Political parties have these long traditions. Michael represents a very important strand of the tradition of one party. The tradition of the Ontario Liberal Party was a Southwest protest party that was to the right of the Conservatives. Not many people here know that. When I tell a lot of Liberals, and I haven't even read the Mitch Hepburn biography yet. I want to get closer to the farm roots of my own party to understand where we need to go. And so having a culture of being informed about what the party is about and having a learning culture within a party, as unions do or used to do, through places like universities, through organizations like yours, I think is really key to having partisanship be about an engagement around ideas, not just an engagement around the sharing of spoils. Especially for parties in power, which inevitably, no matter what the party is going to start to clamp down on the dissent the longer it's in power.
I just want to do a quick audience poll because we're coming to the end of our time together, and I know not everyone got asked to ask their question. Maybe a few can hang around on the break to take those. But I'm just curious, can you put up your hand if you would consider joining a party today? And then I'm going to ask the question if you're like, I'm done parties forever. So who's open to joining a party today? If like the right leader and culture came along. And who's on the other side of the fence now who would I'm done with parties, thank you. There's no redeeming now. Okay, so I think this crowd is a little bit more optimistic. We have not killed the spirit of getting engaged. I want to give all panelists just a minute to close off with some thoughts, and I would encourage them to think about a message that, what gives you hope right now that this picture is going to improve and turn around? Because I know if you're in the democracy business or you spend time thinking about democracy, it's pretty damn depressing these days. So can you give us something that's going to be uplifting? And Sev, can we reverse order this?
Okay.
Thanks.
If you would like to have a day of optimism, come and job shadow me for one. At Civic Action, we get to spend all day, every day, getting done on big urban issues where leaders from all sectors just dive in and do it. And we have a network of 2,000 rising leaders, some of them are in the room actually this morning, who have decided to put up their hand for civic engagement and don't want to do it in a partisan way. And so we are shaping parts of this city, whether it's youth unemployment, public spaces. You've got Dave Meslin in the audience here this morning. He's one of the rock stars that gets stuff done by not coloring inside the lines. And so I am extraordinarily hopeful for our future because I get to spend every day with people who've decided to dive in and just get stuff done. We're not an advocacy shop. We don't write reports. We're Civic Action, not civic chit-chat. And in this world of attention deficit disorder reality, right? We all have the attention spans of a squirrel on a park field. There are ways, and there is increasingly a movement of people that want to be involved in their community, that want to affect their country, that want to focus on the actions that are real, that feel palpable in their lives. But they don't need to be resigned to the words and ideas of politics alone. Business is booming on my side of the ledger, and I invite all of you to join us.
Thank you, Sev.
So I'm one of the co-chairs of this conference, and I would just point out to the exhibitors and the sponsors, which I have to do anyway, and I'm happy to do so. But notice that there's not a political party among them. Last year we did have a few political parties represented. This year we don't. We do have political party representation from from most of the persuasions, I believe, represented at this conference. But it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy to get people who are more explicitly identified as partisan to come to this. So there is clearly work to be done, and I would indicate that there is some pull factor from the civil society organizations that have booths, some of which work more explicitly in political engagement, some of which less so, that give me hope.
Great. Thank you. Minister.
As I said, I'm an incredibly optimistic and hopeful person, and one of the things that gives me hope is I make a concerted and intentional effort to participate in Women in House programs. And those are programs where young women from different universities around Canada come and shadow me for a day. And I am so inspired by them every single time I meet them, because they're people from every walk of life, every corner of Canada, and they're young women who see themselves as future members of Parliament and future leaders. And I think that we have an incredibly rich, talented cohort of young people who are going to do amazing things for this country. And I think that the other thing that gives me incredible hope is just Canadians. As Sev said, come shadow me for a day, come to my riding and meet the people who are doing such good things and good work and who are giving of themselves for issues that they care about and are passionate about. And there's a lot of scary stuff on the horizon, which you'll hear me talk about shortly. But ultimately, I really believe in Canadians. I believe in what they believe for our country, and I'm really optimistic and hopeful for the future. And I think the very fact that there's this many of you in the room right now talking about democracy is awesome, and I think that that speaks to the fact that we have a really strong fabric here in Canada that we can only continue to build on.
Thank you. And last up, 1 minute, bring us home, Michael.
Well, thank you, Jane, and thank you all for coming out. Thanks to my fellow panelists here for coming out and sharing their ideas. I'm optimistic about the chance for reform, and here's why. Increasingly, I'm seeing groups like this assemble across the country who are interested in changing our political system. I'm optimistic because we have achieved significant political reforms in Canada. The one thing we get really right in this country is political finance. You know, Mr. Chrétien and subsequently Mr. Harper introduced some of the strictest political financing laws of any national government in the OECD. Corporate and union donations are banned. Donations are capped at a strict roughly $1,600 per year. It's transparent. We do that right. They do not get that right south of the border. It's a mess. But I also believe in being humble. And humility is the mark of a society that can learn from others. And there are things that other democracies do much better than we do when it comes to the way they regulate political parties, the way they regulate political nomination contests and leadership contests. And the United States and the UK and Australia do it much better than we do. We need to take parties from being top-down, centrally controlled organizations where the party leader controls the party, controls riding associations, approves or vetoes party candidates, controls members of Parliament, and flip it upside down to the way it should be in a Westminster parliamentary democracy. A bottom-up organization where you as a citizen have the right, without paying a fee, to join a party. You have the right to vote in a party nomination. When an MP is elected, that MP can vote more freely on the floor of the House of Commons without the fear of being kicked out of the party, denied a party nomination, et cetera, et cetera. And if we do that, we'll create a much more participatory democracy where ordinary Canadians' voices are heard and where we get a much greater diversity of views on the floor of the House of Commons instead of 3 large voting blocks where every member is whipped into compliance by an all-powerful party leader. And if we do that, we won't have the need for a plethora of new parties popping up because people will find change within the old brokerage mainline party system. And that's the change I believe we ought to fight for.
Let's thank our panelists. Every one of them articulated strong views this morning with us. Thank you. It was wonderful. I think a full exchange, as the minister said, a great example of democracy in action. And I think we can all leave the room knowing we've been invited to take part in parties, to take part in civil society, and to make sure that we extend that invitation to others, because this is a group of, I think, highly engaged Canadians. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the Democracy Exchange. Just as a little note, Samara is going to be doing some research on political parties, so do stay tuned if you're interested in this issue.